It's just more CSS. And with that, it's one of those things that tends to get overlooked when you refactor. If you're in startups like me, what happens a lot is you build a prototype and then your CEO comes to you and you're like, you gotta make that thing look better. We're demoing this to a big VC or a big client tomorrow. So you throw some CSS at it, great. And then a week later, weeks go by, you keep doing this. You're adding CSS kind of ad hoc. And meanwhile, your backend code might get refactored. Even your JavaScript will get refactored. But CSS is one of those things that just kind of lingers on and on. You tend to, instead of reusing things, you tend to just add more of it because you never quite know where the styles are, what the styles do, what the class names are, or whether huge chunks of CSS are even used anywhere in your app anymore. And no one really wants to go find out. It's like this great unknown. So this was kind of the code base that I inherited, and that was me. So let's say you inherit a code base that looks like that. That was how it was in my mind. The problem with it is, sure, nothing's really broken, right? But you definitely get the sense that when you're trying to add new features, or when you're trying to change something, or your designer decides to remake a widget, you feel the pain of having to go back into that CSS and make any sort of change. Everything is so brittle. It's so easy to introduce bugs. And I introduced bugs like crazy because I didn't know. I was just making a little change here, and who knew that it was affecting things on other pages I didn't even know about. So how do we change that back into this cute CSS that I really like to play around with and make things look good in? Well, let's go on our quest. So you wouldn't go fighting a dragon barehanded, and there's been a great proliferation of tools now for CSS. So let's go over some of it. There's tools, okay. Definitely, as I mentioned, use a preprocessor. Your choices here are Sass or less. Both are good, although there seems to be more support for Sass now, although Bootstrap is written in less. And I'm a Rails developer as well, so Sass was a natural choice, there was no question. And I'll just go over a brief overview of the features. What does it give you? Variables, which are great, because I'm sure you've seen this before where you have to define the same thing in all over the CSS, and it can really be made a lot more dry if you can just define it in one place right at the top. Okay, that's cool. But you can also do math with it. This is the functions that you can do here is why I now enjoy prototyping directly in CSS and HTML versus even bothering opening up Photoshop. And of course, colors. This is a great one because I'm not very good at reading text. I don't know about you guys. And even better, you can do things like this, like darken colors, lighten colors, all in CSS. These are functions that are available in Sass and less. Okay, variables, cool. Not amazing, but what if you had great chunks of CSS that you want to be able to reuse in different parts? That's where mix-ins come in. So let's say we have this little disclosure arrow, and we want that to appear in our little table cells, list cells, what have you. So there's a lot of styles that go into making a little arrow like that. You want it to be centered in your cell and things like that. So it's not trivial. But now you can wrap all of that CSS into a mix-in and then just include it wherever you need it. So again, that makes things a lot more dry and allows you to make reusable modules. But even better than mix-ins that you have to write are mix-ins that you don't even have to write. So here, I'm sure you've all done this many times, are vendor prefixes for things that are not super standard yet. So here I have an example of gradient, and who wants to write this all over the CSS, right? It would be much better to just write one line and make sure that the CSS that gets produced is that. There's additional tools that help you do that. Compass, which is a layer on top of Sass that provides a lot of mix-ins and a lot of functions. I see some people hopping back there. Sorry, you can't see the bottom? Okay, it's just the logos for Compass and Bootstrap. That's all. So Bootstrap, it also, if you're just using the CSS version of Bootstrap, that's great. But if you actually go look at the source for less, or which is what I use, a Sass port of Bootstrap, it actually contains all of the mix-ins that are like written in Bootstrap. So you can just use those yourself as well. And they save you a lot of time because now you don't have to go define your own mix-ins for very basic stuff like gradients, border radius, all of that stuff. Question?
From 26, you no longer need any of those. You can just use 20. That's it.
Sorry, what?
Okay, all of these are deprecated now. You can just use linear 20.
Yeah.
From 26.
Right. So
Firefox is a long time.
yeah. So the comment was you don't actually need to do vendor prefixes for a lot of these things anymore, and that's true. And it's really up to you, depending on how far back in browsers you have to support. But that is a very good point. A lot of vendor prefixes are no longer necessary. All right. So on any quest, we need a map to tell us where to go, or at least agree on where we should be going. So this is where a style guide is very useful, especially if you have multiple developers working on the same code base. These are just good ways to set some ground rules so that everyone knows what is expected of them and that your code looks very consistent. Naming conventions, which I'll cover, and then some other things like where do you use pixels, where do you use EMs. I don't really care which one you use, but you guys in your own code base should agree on, font sizes should use EMs, or widths should use pixels, and so on. I always recommend using classes for styling and not to attach styling to IDs, but in some cases you might want to allow IDs to be styled, like for example for navigation or footers where you know there's only one of that element. And finally, very basic white space. You use 2 pixels, 4 pixels, tabs. Who cares? But agree on one thing so that you don't end up having to re-indent every file that you see. So now that we have our tools under our belt, let's talk about some more specific strategies. Someone very wise once said, there's only 2 hard things in computer science. And good news, in CSS we don't really have to worry about cache invalidation that much. So really it just comes down to naming things. So when you're naming your classes, you want to be as specific as possible. So instead of just having a loading class, like who knows what a loading class does? Like, is it a loading indicator? Is it a little box that pops up that loads something? You don't know. So if you make your class very specific, then that gives an indication to other developers what that class is for, and it prevents them from trying to use your class somewhere else without realizing that they're actually redefining something that they shouldn't be. That always introduces a lot of bugs. Another good thing about being very specific with your class names is that now you can logically group classes with, like, for example, a prefix. So everything that starts with sidebar are logically grouped together. Very basic stuff, but when you're just kind of going cowboy on your CSS, these are things that often get overlooked. Now this is a big topic, separating behavior, aka JavaScript, from your CSS. So when you first start making a code prototype, you slap a class on an element, you write some styles, and then you're like, hey, I want this thing to like hide and show or whatever. So you make it into a jQuery selector, and now you're attaching some JavaScript to that class. Really bad idea. Why? Because later on, what happens if you decide to change the styles for that element, or you decide you need like a parent element to have those styles. So now you're changing the classes in the DOM, but there's JavaScript behavior that's being attached to those same elements, and now you have very tightly coupled JavaScript and CSS and DOM all in the same thing, and that's bad for refactoring. So some strategies for how to separate JavaScript from CSS. A very simple way is simply to prefix all of the classes that you use for JavaScript with something like JS or whatever you want, just so that you know they're used only for JavaScript and not for styling. A more advanced way is use classes only for styling, and anytime you need to hook JavaScript into your DOM, use something like data attributes. And now that I'm sure you all use like jQuery or something similar, it makes selecting on things like data attributes very easy. And finally, you can also use your custom bindings. So this is an example from Angular, where they have a specific thing called directives that they use to hook into HTML. So they never use classes for JavaScript. And since I started using Angular, I never really worried about this. And one thing I want to point out is that your own JavaScript is one thing, but oftentimes there's third-party JavaScript that you may not know about that's actually using your classes. And when you're refactoring, you have to be very mindful of that. An example is we use Mixpanel for tracking analytics. And one time I moved a class from the anchor tag to a parent element. And what happened was that link stopped working. And I was like scratching my head, what do you mean the link stopped working? It's a link. And what happened was that we had a Mixpanel little thing that hooked into that class name, and it expects it to be on an anchor tag. If it's not on an anchor tag, it breaks that tag. So when you're refactoring your CSS, you have to watch out for all of these things. I've heard of other examples where they've broken their Google Analytics tracking because they've renamed class names, and Google Analytics somewhere, not even in your code base, is expecting these elements to be there, named after certain things. So in these cases now, I always prefix anything that Mixpanel uses with MX, and if you use Google Analytics, you might want to prefix it with GA or something like that. Another thing about naming is make them functional. I once wrote a pretty sizable style definition for a class called Blue Box. And one day we decided the box shouldn't be blue anymore. So this just makes it really confusing for developers that come after you when your styles have changed and they're trying to find, like, where is this blue box? What is it doing? It makes it very confusing. So always try to name your classes after functionality as opposed to style attributes. Naming is also very important when it comes down to reusable modules. As I kind of mentioned or alluded to before, you really want to namespace your class names. This is an example where let's say you have a menu, great, menu, and then you decide you want a wide version of that menu. Okay, great, width is 100%. And so you add a wide class. But then it's very tempting to then use that wide class somewhere else. Like say, hey, I also want a wide text box, so let me have a wide text box, and you attach that wide class to the text box. Bad idea, because what happens if you want your text box to be a different width than your menu? And then you end up having to hunt through your code base for all the places where the wide class is attached only to a text box, and you end up having to rename it anyway. So instead of doing that, just nip it in the bud and namespace all of your classes that you're using. And you're like, okay, well that doesn't make my code very dry because I have, this width is 100% in all these different places. Well, this is where you should be using mix-ins or inheritance to bundle common styles and then use that in your different CSS files. And let's look at an example of what mix-ins looks like in the real world. So here at the very top, I have a very simple cell border. And then we have a mix-in that's for like a basic cell that uses that cell border. And then I have a very simple list style for a list. And all it does is it has rounded corners, because I love rounded corners. You can pass in like a super rounded corner, or you can use a default. Great thing about mix-ins. And then all it does is when you have an active cell, it will swap the background and the foreground color. So something somewhat complex, but you can build up to that functionality, and now you can use that style definition in your namespace classes. And for those at the back, it's just a user list that includes a basic list and the activity list that includes a basic list mixin. I'll have these slides online. Now let's talk about organization. So how many of you have come into a code base where all of your CSS is in one giant file? Yeah? Okay. It's not good. So definitely you want to have your CSS separated into logical modules that all of this stuff in one CSS file should have something to do with each other so that it makes sense to other developers. But of course you can't just include like 100 style sheets in your HTML because that would make it very not performant. Well, again, this is where you should use Sass or less, which compiles all of your different files into a master style sheet, which then gets output as one big CSS file. And we'll take a look at what a master style sheet looks like in just a little bit. But I just want to point out that when you use import, so Sass and less both use the import key for importing those files. But CSS also has an import, and you might be tempted to, hey, I'll just use the CSS import. Don't do that. The CSS import will actually make another HTTP request, and that's not very performant. So you're not actually saving yourself any time by using the CSS import. There are some cases where, oh, question?
Yeah, what about with fonts?
What about with fonts?
Yeah, so like if you're not using a standard font, using the import in CSS for importing non-standard fonts.
Yeah, that's okay because fonts are separate styles anyway, so you kind of have to use that. Yeah. So there are some cases where you do want to have separate style sheets. I use a separate style sheet for when we publish our web pages only to our iOS app, so we actually serve up certain web pages as web views within our iPhone app, and in those cases I use a different style sheet. And now let's look at an example of a master style sheet. So at the top, I include my good friends, Compass and Bootstrap. And I want to point out that with Bootstrap, you actually have the option of overriding their defaults. So colors, text sizes, and so on. And that's why I include my variables file above the Bootstrap file. And that's a little different from how you normally override things in CSS, because you normally override things by adding them afterwards. Then I include my own mixins, my base styles. So these are like, how big you want your H1 headers to be, H2, and so on. Layout, where, if you use a grid, this is where your stuff would go. Basically, it defines where things go on a page. And then comes the meat of it, which are all the modules. So these are all the reusable components that you have within your app and can be shared across your website. I also have some styles for page-specific styles, but these can really be modules as well. There's not really much of a difference. And then finally, at the very bottom, I have responsive and retina styles, and these are meant to override everything based on media queries. So now that we have some training under our belt, it's ready, it's time to face the enemy, or at least a screenshot of it. So this is a sliver of the CSS that I refactored. I don't know if you, in the last talk, some people said they've seen CSS written like this. I have never before. The reason that I learned why someone would write CSS like this is that now you can just skim down the side and see all the selectors down the side. But you have a text editor. Use your text editor's code folding function to do that. Don't actually write your CSS like this. Can you imagine the merge conflicts? Like every line. You can also see there's a lot of IDs being used, bad. And where we do use classes, it's very generic names like tabs. So now anytime, anywhere there's a tab class, it's going to inherit these styles. So that's not very good either. Another thing you'll see is that sometimes there's vendor prefixes and sometimes there's not. It's not very consistent. Let's go through some of these in more detail. Important. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean not important. If you come from a coding background, it's very confusing. It means very important. One of the really oddities about CSS. So when you put important after a particular style attribute, it means that whenever it tries to override it later on, it can't. Unless you put important after it. And what happens then? It's an arms race to like see, who can get more important into the code base, and then everything ends up being important at some point.
So basically, you use the important, it means you can overwrite something, or something you can't overwrite.
Yeah, so the question is, what does important mean? Does it mean you can or cannot overwrite it? So when you add important after a style, let's say font color is green, and you try to redefine it later on and say font color is red, it won't work.
Okay, so then that's about
Yeah. So what important allows you to do is it allows you to circumvent the C in CSS, the cascading part, which is not very helpful when you're trying to debug and you're like, why doesn't it work? And a lot of time, why developers use important is because of this. Their selectors are too specific. When you have something that looks like this, and then you try to add a class to the anchor tag at the very end, like selected, let's say, a.selected, you can't just write your style like a.selected. It won't work because there's this really long selector. And unless you copy that and then add a.selected, that's just very burdensome. So isn't it just easier to write important and then not have to worry about things? Well, not quite, because CSS specificity rules are very, very difficult to understand, especially it's just very nuanced. So instead of actually making all of your developers figure out exactly when CSS applies which style when, just don't bother. Just make your CSS easy to understand. Just slap a class on the end of that anchor tag and style that instead of writing all of this. Because the other thing about having a very long, complicated selector is that you're now coupling your CSS to your HTML. Because what happens if you decide, hey, you don't need that group class in the middle, or you don't want it to be a list, you want it to be just divs. Now you have to go and change all of your CSS because you've decided to refactor your HTML. So just don't do it. Then you might also see something weird like that. I guess you might want to have this if you have a nav element that is sometimes in a header and then sometimes in a footer, but on a different page, because IDs are unique on a page, right? If you do decide to style IDs, just treat them as global across your whole CSS. That'll make your lives easier and you won't end up having really awkward selectors like those. And now we're going to talk about where your CSS lives. So one thing that the code example I didn't show was that the CSS was spread out everywhere. We had some in CSS files, but the bulk of the CSS was actually inline. It was literally on every page. And that was a nightmare to debug because I never knew where the CSS was until I actually went hunting for it. That brings us to inline styles. Avoid wherever possible. Sometimes, in very rare cases, you may want to use inline styles if you need to have super high performance. there's sometimes where inline styles might be working for you. But if you're like working on a generic app, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to have to go hunting in your HTML for those styles. So always keep your CSS in CSS. Another thing I ran into was that for every CSS file that we did have, there was another file called mobile.css that was 98% the same. I don't know why, because when you have mobile styles that you want to override, you should really just be overwriting the styles you need to. Don't duplicate the file and then change like a few things on it to make it mobile. Because what it will inevitably happen is those two files will get out of sync, and you're not going to test on mobile every time you make a change, and you'll introduce bugs slowly but surely. Great. Now we are ready to refactor. So I'll introduce my 3 rules for refactoring. Number 1 rule is to stop the bleeding. And what that means is just stop adding bad CSS. It's really that simple. There's a good quote that I like, which is that broken code gets fixed, but sloppy code lives on forever. And CSS just is one of those things that gets sloppier and sloppier. It grows and grows. And it's really sad when you have to go back in and make a change. That's when you feel the pain. And you can't explain to your boss why it takes you a week to make something as simple as a little style change, because in the middle you're fixing all these bugs and you realize that you've broken things on other pages. It's just a bad way to go. Second rule is a Boy Scout rule. If there's any Boy Scouts who know this. It's that leave your campground better than you found it. In this case, your campground is your code base. So you want to make it clean, you want to keep it nice so other people want to come and visit your code base and play in it, and you want to go visit your own code base too. And my third rule is treat CSS as code. If you don't take anything else away from today, just remember this. Because I know it's easy to think about CSS as being this like fluffy thing. It's not really a real programming language. I know, it's not. But it still deserves your respect. And it deserves to be refactored along with everything else. And you will be much happier for it in the long run. Okay, so now we're refactoring. And you might have this gust of energy, you've heard this talk, you're like, let's go. Okay, hold on. Don't try to do it all at once. And these are pretty generic rules for any type of refactoring you're doing. Don't try to do it all at once. Because if you're doing too much refactoring at the same time, what inevitably happens is that you're actually doing like a mini rewrite. And the risk with doing that is that now you're stopping future development or stopping bug fixes because you're like, don't touch my CSS, I'm refactoring over here. And that's not good. So the strategy that I took was I went through each page, I broke down every single thing into as small a module, a reusable module as possible, and then moved each one and upgraded the CSS for each one slowly. And meanwhile, I was still shipping features and making bug fixes through the site. So the whole process did take me maybe 2 to 3 months, but I wasn't stuck or blocked doing development work at all on anything else. And at the time, we were also moving our whole site to be responsive, and that was a great excuse to actually go in and touch every single page. But in general, you don't have to go do all of your CSS refactoring at once. Follow the Boy Scout rule. When you're in there, when you're already touching that code, make it better, and then over time, your code will get better. So after I broke down all of the little components, and I refactored those, then I went through and did it for all the pages, and only after I did all of that did I go and refactor the global styles. Because the global styles are often the hardest, because they touch everything else. And I'll get to that in a little second. When you're moving and adding styles, you want to create new files. This was the best strategy that I had. Instead of just adding like new styles to your existing files, it becomes very confusing what's good and what's not good. So if you always create new files, then it makes a very clear delineation between, hey, here's the refactor code, and here's still the old crap that we're living with for now. But if you have that clear mark, it means that once everything is moved over, and you know that there's no more dependencies on that old code, it becomes very easy to go and delete that CSS. Another strategy you want to follow is you can also namespace your your new styles, and this makes it easy to work in like prototype features or new features that you're not sure you're going to keep around. And what that allows you to do is that if you do decide to keep it around, then it makes it easy to rename and just delete the old styles. But if you don't decide to keep it around, it makes it very easy to just remove and forget about. And finally, yes, question?
Oh, sorry, I tried that approach and I really liked that, but then at some point, the new becomes the old. And then you have to go back and change it everywhere in CSS and also in
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, you do use new and then it becomes old. Yeah. So this is kind of a bad example. I don't actually literally postfix my classes with new. It's meant to be an example to like postfix it with something, like maybe beta 1 or something like that. But once you do move over, you should actually go back, delete the old styles, and then rename your new styles to what the class name was before.
So this is literally a temporary thing
Yes.
during the refactor.
Yes, it's a temporary thing. So you might be wondering, okay, well, aren't I duplicating code? Like I'll have these styles that are new, but I also have these old styles that are still being used and they're actually styling some of the same thing. That's true. You may actually have to live with these duplicated styles for a while, but I felt like that was a good trade-off versus quitting your job. And then also don't extend your old existing code, because that makes it easier to delete the old code once you're done. Which brings us to deleting styles, which is arguably the hardest part about refactoring CSS, because God knows like where all these things are actually used. It makes, like JavaScript now makes it even harder to figure that out, because you might have some JavaScript that's like dynamically adding a class to an element, and you wouldn't even know when you're just looking at the HTML. I wish there was a magic bullet, but there's not. It just comes down to good old regular expressions. There are tools that help you find dead code, but I've never found any of them to be foolproof, and I've always had to just fall back to using regular expressions. The key here, though, is to search absolutely everywhere. And I always do like a global search across the entire code base, because you never know where these things might pop up. But when you're refactoring a CSS and now you have very specific names, it does make it a lot easier going forward, because who wants to look for the loading class in your code base? That's not very fun. And then finally, browser test as you go, because you don't want to do a whole bunch of refactoring and then open it up and realize that it doesn't work. It makes trying to debug those things a lot harder. So I usually have like what it's supposed to look like, maybe the production version, what I'm working on, open at the same time, making my changes incrementally and constantly refreshing. There you go. We're at the end of our quest, and hopefully this will mark the beginning of your own quest. But we hopefully saved the prince or princess or frog or whatever have you, tamed the dragon a little bit, turned it maybe not into a furry kitten, but something closer to that. Thank you. Okay, I'll take questions now.
Hi. I thought this was really wonderful. I agree with all of it. is that you should probably always, as you're adding new styles and writing them and testing them out, be using web developer tools. The developer tools built into Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Opera, every single browser has them. And if you're not using them, my thought is that you're not really doing your job. You might not. You're essentially flying blind if you're not using them. That might be entirely obvious and sort of like assumed by the presentation, but it's definitely worth knowing.
Yeah, very good point. Definitely use those developer tools. WebKit developer tools are great. Firefox is great. I didn't mention them in my talk, but absolutely use them, and I have it open all of the time.
I'd like to ask a SAS specific question. I'm running in, we're using it for Compass, it's going fantastically. But one of the problems I'm running into is when I'm actually looking at the SAS. Right, so I'm in Visual Studio, I'm reading SAS, and we're using Mindscape as a plugin for Visual Studio that lets you see the SAS is colored so it's meaningful. And when I compare it at that level, I don't have any tools to better debug them because I've got multiple people contributing. Some people are mixing it, detecting an error. You don't SAS specific.
I wasn't taking on that anymore.
So the question is there a tool that helps you debug SAS where it's producing CSS correctly, but is throwing an error in SAS?
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure what's going on, but basically, if you know any debugging tools for SAS, I'm interested.
I've never run into that because usually if SAS throws an error, it refuses to create the CSS.
Yeah, well, compile.
Yeah.
I'm not compiling. Okay, so it may just be a funky.
It might be a warning. Is it? Yeah, not at this time. Okay.
We're trying to figure out the best ways to organize our code around that. Is there an approach you take to structure so things in terms of like this subdirectory tree looks like the regular project, but only has that media query style, or should you just do it all like here's large, here's medium, here's so on?
So the question is, how do you deal with organizing your media queries files? Are you using SAS 3.2?
We use, I think we're using Compass on top of it.
Okay, so I know in 3.2 you can actually make your media queries into kind of like variables, and so what that allows you to do is define all of your different sizes in one place, and that helps with just media queries in general, so you don't have to remember all the different sizes, screen sizes that you're developing for. When I showed the organization file, I had all of my media queries at the bottom, but you could also include only the ones you need inside your modules, like specifically for the modules that you're overriding. That's another strategy if you don't want to keep all of your media queries separate. Yeah. But maybe we can talk after, yeah. Yep.
Do you like using pseudo selectors like immediate child and all those, or do you think that ties it to the HTML too much?
The question is, do I use or do I recommend using things like last child, those types of selectors, pseudo selectors? Yeah, I definitely use them because it really depends on what you need it for, right? If it's like zebra striping your table, why wouldn't you use it, right? If you want to make sure that the border shows up only on the last table cell, definitely use it. Yeah, it makes sense. I love them. I'm so glad that there's wide browser support for them now.
You mentioned that slides would be available online. Is there a link for that?
Not yet, because SlideShare is taking forever to like convert it, but I will tweet it with the hashtag for the conference.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't mention Silas at all as far as kind of the competitors. I'm just curious, is that one you're just not as familiar with, or do you feel like it's not on the same? Yeah, it seems like it has all the features of Sass and Less and is getting pretty popular in the Node community.
Yes, so the question is, why did I not recommend Silas? It was just too new at the time, and I really haven't really looked into it myself, so I didn't feel comfortable just like slapping it up there.
Cool, yeah.
But totally, I'm planning on looking into it very soon.
Silence and fluidity together.
That was what?
Fluidity together. Yeah, much better than good.
Which is better than that?
Fluidity.
Yeah.
Just as a nosy aside, HTML5 and CSS3 are considered Turing complete. So in theory, any algorithm can be used So just speaking to the power of those two tools, they're very good powerful. So I know, I think you mentioned that people don't treat it like fun, but it is actually.
Oh. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't show, okay, so the question was, why don't I use extend versus mixins? It really depends on the particular use case. I just wanted to show like an overview of Sass without, getting into a lot of the different functionality. But absolutely, you can also use extend and inheritance. Yeah, it really depends on the type of code that you're writing. But, I think there was, yeah.
Yeah, so I just article in CSS things saying that actually using ID is more aware in terms of performance and easier class. But you said just using as a function, so I wasn't so clear exactly like what's of the
So the question is, ID is supposed to be more performant than classes. So I think that used to be true, and maybe it's like slightly more performant, but browsers have gotten a lot faster, and the drawbacks with using IDs for styling, it just, they don't outweigh like that tiny performance. Yeah.
I just have two general comments. I mean, tools are great, Stylus, Sass, Less, whatever, but usually the biggest issue with CSS is like the process, right? Like naming conventions. Like if you use all the tools, it won't prevent some of those. But the question I do have for you was, there are like two big camps of like CSS naming. If you get in like deep into that, they have like, they call it SMACS, it's SMA CSS,
Yeah, so,
and object-oriented CSS. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
yeah, so the question is, do I have any thoughts on SMACS versus object-oriented CSS? I think they actually espouse a lot of the same things. And I think it really just, what's his name? He came up with like a better name with SMACS. It stands for Scalable
Modular architecture.
Yeah, modular architecture CSS. And yeah, I think they actually espouse a lot of the same goals for maintainability of CSS, and scalability with CSS really just means maintainability. It means that you can have like really big websites that people can continue to like build on top of without breaking all kinds of things everywhere. I think philosophically, I think they're aligned. I think CSS just came out earlier, and then SMACS came out with a better name, but it's, yeah.
Thank you so much. And would you mind talking just a little bit about the split of CSS for style and CSS for layout?
Okay, so thoughts about CSS for style versus CSS for layout?
Because there's certain styles that result in more specific to layouts, and others that have to do with color and those sorts of things.
Right. So when it comes to the general layout of the site, I do, as you saw, I have a separate file for just denoting layout. And sometimes I define the same style in two places. So the footer will have its layout styles in the layout file, but but then the styling, like what color it is, what font it is, in a module. That's just a personal preference. I think you can do things differently. When it comes to like other elements though, I do tend to, like certain modules, I do tend to just group everything under that one file. I don't then go separating out the layout styles from the not really duplicating. Maybe let's chat afterwards.
Wondering if you tried lazy loading CSS, just the bare minimum. You have a large single page app and just very small amount of CSS for the initial page, and we can probably lazy load the rest of the page at a later point in time. But we organize using modular CSS and all that, but it's incredibly complex to organize it, and also lazy load. I was wondering if you tried it.
So the question is thoughts on lazy loading CSS and how it can get complicated, because now you have the CSS that doesn't get loaded on initial page load. We don't load any CSS right now lazily because our app, I mean, it was like a few thousand lines of CSS, but it's not like a huge app. And the benefit of having all of that CSS ready to go and cached, and generally, like most of it will get used, so we don't lazy load. But if you have an app that you do want to lazy load, then you can. Yeah, but maybe let's chat after if we have something very specific. Okay. Yes.
Can we use that and predict together?
As a what?
Oh, okay. I haven't actually heard of this library for prefixing things automatically, but that sounds cool.
So you said you had to go through like all that messy CSS. So was that something you took on all at one time? Did you piece it out? Like, is there a way that you should approach implementing a non-SAS system into using SAS?
So the question is, how did I turn all of that CSS into SAS? Did I do it all at once? I actually did literally just rename everything into SAS. That was like the first thing I did, so then I could start using SAS features right away. So yeah.
So if you didn't have that ability, if you had 10, 15, 20,000 lines of CSS that had to be refactored, how would you go about beginning that? Would you do it all of one again?
Well, the thing is, SAS is a superset of CSS, so you can just rename all of your CSS files into SAS, start using the import features, and start using SAS functionality right away. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that.
I could add to that, because we just went through that.
Okay.
And I can't give you the specifics because my teammate who actually ran the line of code isn't sitting here. But within SAS, so we had 15,000 lines of CSS, straight CSS. And there was something we could run it through, we probably just ran a Ruby script on it, and it SAS'd a lot of our work like that. Because then when I went back and looked at it, it's like, oh good, I don't have to do that. So it did a lot of it for me. And the beauty of it is if you haven't used SAS, by default, you'll now quickly learn a lot of the ways to use it really efficiently. So when you start doing your own stuff, then you can look, oh yeah, they did it that way, okay. Because you'll already understand your own CSS. So that's, I don't remember the script, but it must have been easy to find because none of us had done it before. And within a day, we were ready to go.
Okay. Awesome.
Was there a question over here? Alright, so the question is, how do you balance having longer selectors versus having more markup because now you have to apply classes to your elements? I think having classes to your elements, which is what I espouse, is a better way to go because if you decide to then change those elements, you know that that's the style that's being applied because the class name is right there. But if you just have an element that you're styling somewhere, it's not immediately obvious in your HTML that that has styles associated with it. So if you decide to change, for example, the list into divs, you don't realize that, hey, all of a sudden my styles are gone. What happened? You have to now go hunting through your CSS to go find where those styles were defined and then rename them. And the trouble that comes from that is that, hey, you might have that somewhere else where it is still using lists, and now if you just rename it, you can't, because somewhere else the HTML has stayed the same.
So I always understood that you would use class whenever you're wanting to style multiple things the same, but you use ID when you're going in for the more specific, like, I want this one, you know,
Yeah.
to do this or that. Did you kind of expound upon that, or?
Yeah, so the question is, the thinking is that you should use classes for things that get reused a lot throughout the page, and then IDs for very specific things. I think that used to be the thinking, but now classes, like selecting on classes, there's basically no performance penalty. So there's no reason why you can't just have very unique class names, even if it is only used one time. Yeah. It just makes things a lot more consistent. You always know that if you have a class, there might be styling associated with it. Go look in your CSS. Yeah. Because if you have an ID, you can have an ID on all kinds of things, but you might not know that, hey, there's actually styling associated with that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I generally would only ID class things in HTML or
Yeah.
but if you're using the ID for basically your notes in your HTML, that makes sense.
Yeah. And sometimes, like if you use certain, like for example, if you use Rails and you have things that create that HTML for you, you might not have as much control over what IDs are called in forms, for example, and stuff like that. So it just makes things cleaner to keep those concerns separate. One more question? Last question?
So I usually work in teams on most projects. So now we have this great knowledge. How can we encourage our team members to do this? Like we can go back and say, like, we should be doing all this stuff. You're like, he's just on the conference side, forget it. Like, how did you deal with that kind of stuff?
So how did I deal with essentially convincing my boss or team that CSS needs to be refactored? Well, I don't know if my example was very extreme, but I was basically like, if we don't refactor this, like I can't work in this code base. It was pretty much at the limit of what it can do. But if your code isn't that bad, I recommend that you could just not tell your team or your boss or whoever is the blocker and just like actually secretly do some of these things. And if they work, then you can be like, hey, how come your productivity is so high? Then you can be like, oh, I'll share my secrets with you and do it that way. But yeah, you don't, I've heard many developers say they don't tell higher ups that they're actually doing refactoring. They'll just like do it, and maybe when they're estimating their project points, they'll add a couple points to it.
Not even higher ups, they're just like your peers, right? Like,
yeah.
you have 3 people working on CSS, it's different CSS files, but now your naming convention is slightly different. Like, how do I encourage them to do?
Yeah, push for a style guide. If you don't have a style guide, just push for it and say, hey, this is what we're aiming towards. It doesn't mean we have to go back through our code and like redo everything, but this is what we're aiming towards, and any new CSS should follow this format. Yeah. And if you're really fancy, you could even like put in, put it into your build process to like look for those things. Great. Well, thanks so much for attending. And if you have any more questions,